I've been married to Harold Whitman for 50 years come this Saturday. 50 years of standing beside him at church potlucks. 50 years of ironing his shirts. 50 years of playing the devoted wife while neighbors whispered about what a lucky woman I was to have such a good provider, such a respected man in the community. Everyone keeps asking me if I'm excited about the big party. My daughter Susan has been planning it for months. She's rented the fellowship hall at First Methodist, ordered flowers that cost more than my grocery budget, and invited everyone who's anyone in Cedar Falls. She wants it to be perfect. The celebration of a perfect marriage. The golden anniversary of Harold and Eleanor Whitman, pillars of the community. But I can't sleep at night anymore. Haven't been able to for weeks. Because I know what nobody else knows. I know what's been hidden behind Harold's Sunday smile and his deacon's pin. I know what I've been covering up for 37 years. It started when I was cleaning out the attic last month, getting ready for the anniversary party. Susan said we needed to put together a photo display, something sweet and nostalgic for all the guests to admire. I was digging through old boxes when I found it tucked behind some Christmas decorations. A manila envelope, yellowed with age, sealed tight. Inside were photographs, Polaroids, the kind Harold used to take with that camera he was so proud of back in the 80s. But these weren't family pictures. These were photographs of children. Little girls, maybe 8 or 9 years old. They were pictures I'd never seen before, pictures that made my stomach turn to stone. I sat on that dusty attic floor for 2 hours, staring at those images, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no making sense of it. There was only the horrible, crushing weight of understanding that the man I'd shared a bed with for 5 decades was not who I thought he was. Harold had been the youth pastor at our church for 15 years, from 1980 to 1995. He worked with the children's Sunday school, organized camping trips, ran the summer Bible program. Parents trusted him with their babies. They dropped them off with smiles and waves, never suspecting that the man they called Brother Harold was documenting their innocence in ways that would haunt them forever. I thought about every little girl who'd sat on his lap during story time. I thought about every camping trip, every time he'd volunteered to help with bath time at church camp, every moment he'd found an excuse to be alone with someone else's child. And I realized that somewhere deep down, I'd always known something wasn't right. I'd just chosen not to see it. There were times when I'd walked into his study, and he'd quickly turn off the computer. Times when phone calls would come late at night, and he'd step outside to answer them. Times when parents would ask me quietly if Harold had ever made me uncomfortable, and I'd defended him with the loyalty of a good wife, never asking myself why they were asking. The memory that haunts me most happened in 1987. I was in the church kitchen after Sunday service, cleaning up from the potluck, when Linda Henderson approached me. She had her 8-year-old daughter Kelly with her, and Kelly was clinging to her mother's leg like she was afraid to let go. "Eleanor," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take offense." I dried my hands on my apron and smiled at her. "Of course, honey. What is it?" She glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. Has he ever acted inappropriately around Kelly? She's been having nightmares since the church camping trip, and she won't tell me what happened. But she keeps saying she doesn't want to go to Sunday school anymore. I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment and anger. How dare she suggest such a thing about my husband, Harold, who spent his free time mentoring troubled youth and organizing charity drives. Harold, who read Bible stories to children and taught them about God's love. "Linda Henderson," I said, my voice sharp as a blade, "I can't believe you'd even suggest such a thing. Harold has devoted his life to helping children. Maybe you should look at what's happening in your own home, before you start pointing fingers at innocent people." Linda's face went pale. She picked up Kelly, who had started crying, and walked away without another word. The Hendersons stopped coming to church the following week. Within a month, they'd sold their house and moved to another state. I told myself it was because they were embarrassed by their groundless accusations. But now, sitting in my kitchen 37 years later, I understand what really happened. Linda Henderson was a mother trying to protect her child. Kelly was a little girl who'd been hurt and was trying to tell someone, anyone, what had been done to her. And I was the wife who chose loyalty over truth, reputation over justice, comfort over courage. I failed that little girl. I failed her mother. And I failed every other child who came after Kelly, every other victim, who might have been spared if I'd listened instead of defending, if I'd asked questions instead of making excuses. The photographs in that manila envelope weren't just evidence of Harold's crimes. They were proof of my complicity, my willful blindness, my choice to protect a monster, because admitting the truth would have destroyed the life I'd built around his lies. I kept those photographs hidden for 3 weeks, tucked away in my jewelry box where Harold would never think to look. I told myself I needed time to think, time to figure out what to do. But the truth was, I was terrified, not just of what those pictures meant, but of what speaking up would cost me. Because Harold Whitman isn't just my husband, he's the Harold Whitman who built the new church sanctuary with his own hands. He's the Harold Whitman who runs the food bank every Thanksgiving, who visits sick members in the hospital, who everyone in Cedar Falls looks up to as a man of God. If I spoke up, I wouldn't just be destroying him, I'd be destroying the faith of an entire community. During those 3 weeks, I found myself studying Harold like I'd never seen him before. I watched the way he interacted with the young volunteers at the food bank, how his hand lingered on their shoulders when he praised their work. I noticed how he always found reasons to visit families with young daughters, how he'd volunteer to babysit when parents needed a night out. I started paying attention to the way certain children acted around him, how some would light up when they saw him coming, eager for his attention and approval, but others would shrink back, would find excuses to leave the room, would suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. I began to recognize the signs I'd ignored for decades. The way Harold's mood would change after spending time with certain families. The way he'd come home from church events energized and excited, talking about how much he'd helped the children, how grateful their parents were for his guidance. I thought about Sarah Martinez, who'd started having nightmares in 1985, when she was 9 years old. Her parents had brought her to Harold for counseling, thinking a man of God could help their troubled daughter. But instead of getting better, Sarah had gotten worse. She'd started wetting the bed again, started having panic attacks, started begging not to go to church. When her parents finally took her to see a therapist outside our congregation, the family had gradually drifted away from First Methodist. At the time, Harold had explained it by saying some people couldn't handle the truth of God's word, that they preferred the easy answers of secular psychology to the challenging work of faith. I'd believed him. I'd believed everything he told me for 50 years. But now I understood what had really happened. Sarah Martinez had tried to tell someone what Brother Harold was doing to her during their private counseling sessions. And when the truth came out, her parents had done what any loving parents would do. They'd taken their daughter away from the man who was hurting her. I started making a list of all the families who'd left our church suddenly over the years. The Hendersons in 1987, the Martinez family in 1985, the Macreadys in 1991, the Johnsons in 1993, the Patels in 1994. Each time, Harold had an explanation. They'd gotten too comfortable with worldly values. They'd let their faith weaken. They'd been influenced by secular thinking. Each time, I'd nodded and accepted his explanation. Each time, I'd helped him craft the narrative that would protect his reputation and maintain the congregation's faith in his leadership. But I also remembered other things now. How Harold would sometimes come home from work early, claiming he'd felt sick. How he'd volunteer to drive certain children home from youth group when their parents were running late. How he'd offer to help with homework or provide extra tutoring for struggling students. I remembered the times he'd work late at the church, saying he was preparing lessons or organizing activities. I remembered the camping trips, where he'd insist on sleeping in the same cabin as the children, claiming it was for their safety. I remembered the swimming trips, where he'd volunteer to help the younger kids change into their bathing suits. All of it had seemed so innocent at the time. All of it had been explained away as Harold's dedication to his ministry, his love for the children in our congregation. But now I could see it for what it really was. A pattern of predatory behavior that had been happening right under my nose for decades. The anniversary party was scheduled for Saturday, October 14th. Susan had sent out invitations 6 weeks in advance, beautiful cream-colored cards with gold lettering that read, "Harold and Eleanor Whitman request the pleasure of your company as they celebrate 50 years of marriage and love." 50 years of marriage. But how many of those years had been built on lies? How many of those years had I been sharing my home with a man who was systematically abusing children, while I cooked his dinner and ironed his shirts, and played the role of the devoted pastor's wife? I thought about our own daughter, Susan. She'd been a beautiful child, bright and curious and full of life. Harold had been a good father to her, as far as I could tell. He'd never shown any inappropriate interest in her, never made her uncomfortable, never given me reason to worry. But now I wondered if that was because Susan was his daughter, part of his family, part of the image he was trying to maintain. Or if it was because I'd been too close, too present, too likely to notice if something wasn't right. I thought about my granddaughters, Emma and Sophie, ages 8 and 6. They adored their grandfather, looked forward to his visits, loved the special attention he gave them. But now every memory of Harold with my granddaughters made my skin crawl. Had I been putting them at risk? Had I been failing to protect them the same way I'd failed to protect Kelly Henderson, and Sarah Martinez, and all the other children whose names I'd never even learned? Susan called me on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks before the anniversary party, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Mom, I just picked up the photo display boards from the printer. They look absolutely beautiful. I found pictures from every decade of your marriage, and I wrote little captions for each one. There's one from your wedding day, one from when I was born, one from Dad's ordination, one from when you moved into the new house. It's like a whole love story laid out in photographs." I listened to her enthusiasm and felt physically sick, because I knew that every photograph on those display boards was a lie. Every smile, every celebration, every moment of apparent happiness was tainted by the knowledge of what Harold had been doing when the cameras weren't rolling. "That sounds lovely, honey," I managed to say. "I'm so proud of you and Dad," Susan continued. "In a world where marriages fall apart at the first sign of trouble, you two have shown everyone what real love looks like. What commitment means. What it means to build a life together based on faith and trust and mutual respect." Faith and trust and mutual respect. The words cut through me like broken glass. "I've been thinking about what I want to say in my speech at the party," Susan went on. "I want to talk about how you and Dad have been role models for everyone in our community. How you've shown us what it means to serve God and serve others. How your marriage has been a testament to the power of love and faith." I had to get off the phone. I made some excuse about needing to check on something in the oven, promised to call her back later, and hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table and cried until I couldn't breathe, because Susan was right. Harold and I had been role models. We'd been the couple that other couples looked up to, the marriage that young people pointed to as an example of what they wanted to achieve. We'd been living proof that love could last, that faith could sustain a relationship through any challenge, that commitment and dedication could overcome any obstacle. But it had all been a performance. A 50-year performance that had fooled everyone, including me. The next morning, I made a decision that terrified me. I decided to drive to the police station and report what I'd found. I put the photographs in my purse, along with a list of all the families I could remember who'd left our church suddenly over the years. I got dressed in my best outfit, fixed my hair, and applied my makeup carefully. I wanted to look respectable when I walked into that police station. I wanted to look like someone who could be trusted, someone whose word would be taken seriously, because I knew that what I was about to do would be met with skepticism, disbelief, and probably outright hostility from people who'd known Harold for decades. But when I got to the police station, I couldn't get out of the car. I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours, engine running, hands shaking, trying to work up the courage to walk through those doors. Every time I reached for the door handle, I thought about what would happen next. Harold would be arrested. The news would spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Our church would be torn apart. Families would be devastated. Children would be traumatized all over again, as they were forced to relive their worst memories in courtrooms and therapy sessions. And I would be the woman who destroyed everything. The woman who brought down a pillar of the community. The woman who shattered the faith of hundreds of people who'd trusted Harold to guide them in their spiritual journey. I drove home without getting out of the car. I hid the photographs back in my jewelry box and tried to pretend that I could still go through with the anniversary party, that I could still stand beside Harold and accept congratulations on our 50 years of marriage. But I couldn't stop thinking about Kelly Henderson, about Sarah Martinez, about all the other children whose names I didn't know, whose faces I'd never seen, whose pain I'd never acknowledged. 2 days later, I was at the grocery store when I ran into Margaret Chen, a woman I hadn't seen in probably 20 years. She used to bring her daughter Amy to our church back in the 80s, back when Harold was the youth pastor. Margaret looked older, grayer, but her eyes were sharp as ever. She asked me how I was doing, mentioned she'd heard about the big anniversary party. Then she got quiet for a moment, glanced around to make sure nobody was listening, and said something that stopped my heart. "Eleanor," she said, "I need you to know something. Amy never told me what happened until she was in her 20s, but when she did, I wished I'd been brave enough to speak up back then. I always wondered if there were others." She didn't need to say more. I knew exactly what she meant, and I knew she was right. There had been others, are others, because men like Harold don't just stop. They don't age out of their sickness, they don't find God and repent, they don't wake up one day and decide to be decent human beings. "Margaret," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I found something. Something that proves you were right to be concerned." Her eyes widened. "What kind of something?" I told her about the photographs, about the families who'd left the church, about the signs I'd ignored for decades. I told her about my failed trip to the police station, about my fear of destroying the community, about my cowardice in the face of truth. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took my hand. "Eleanor," she said, "I need to tell you something else. Amy wasn't the only one. There were other girls in our church who had the same experience. We all talked about it privately, but none of us felt like we could speak up against someone so respected, so beloved. We were afraid no one would believe us. We were afraid of being blamed, of being told we were making it up, or misunderstanding innocent interactions." "Who else?" I asked. "Kelly Henderson, Sarah Martinez, Jennifer Johnson, Priya Patel, and probably others we don't even know about." Amy kept in touch with some of them over the years. They've all struggled with what happened to them. Some have had trouble with relationships, with trust, with intimacy. Some have needed years of therapy to work through the trauma. I felt like I was drowning. All those children, all those families, all those lives damaged by the man I'd been married to for 50 years. "What do I do?" I asked. Margaret squeezed my hand. "You do what I should have done 20 years ago. You speak up. You tell the truth. You make sure he can't hurt anyone else." That night, I called Amy Chen directly. I'd gotten her number from Margaret, and I called her at home in Seattle, where she now lived with her husband and 2 young daughters. "Mrs. Whitman," Amy's voice was surprised, cautious. "Amy, honey, I need to talk to you about something. Something that happened a long time ago, when you were just a little girl." There was a long pause. Then Amy's voice, smaller now, younger. "What about it? I know what Harold did to you. I know what he did to other children. And I need to know. I need to know if you'd be willing to help me make sure he can't do it to anyone else." Amy started crying. Not the quiet, controlled tears of an adult, but the raw, broken sobs of the child she'd been when Harold first hurt her. "I thought no one would ever believe me," she whispered. "I thought I'd take it to my grave." "I believe you," I said. "I believe you, and I'm going to make sure everyone else believes you too." We talked for 2 hours. Amy told me about the private counseling sessions Harold had arranged for her, supposedly to help with her shyness and social anxiety. She told me about the games he'd played, the secrets he'd made her keep, the way he'd convinced her that she was special, that their relationship was unique and beautiful and blessed by God. She told me about the confusion, the shame, the sense that something was wrong, but not understanding what. She told me about trying to tell her parents, but not having the words to explain what was happening. She told me about the nightmares, the bedwetting, the sudden fear of being alone with any adult man. "I blamed myself for years," Amy said. "I thought I'd done something to invite it, to make him think I wanted it. I thought I was dirty, corrupted, broken in some fundamental way. You were just a child, I said. None of it was your fault. All of it was his fault. I know that now, Amy said. Intellectually, I know that. But the feelings are still there. The shame is still there. I've been in therapy for 15 years trying to work through it. I'm so sorry, I said. I'm so sorry I didn't see it, didn't stop it, didn't protect you. You couldn't have known, Amy said. He was very careful, very manipulative. He made sure that anyone who might have noticed was made to feel like they were imagining things, like they were being unreasonable or suspicious. But I should have listened when your mother tried to tell me. I should have paid attention when you started acting differently. I should have asked questions instead of making excuses. Mrs. Whitman, Amy said gently, you can't change the past, but you can change the future. You can make sure that what happened to me and the other girls doesn't happen to anyone else. The next morning, I called Detective Rosa Martinez at the Cedar Falls Police Department. I told her I had information about crimes that had been committed over several decades, crimes involving children, crimes that were still being covered up. She agreed to meet me that afternoon at the station. I arrived early, sat in the waiting area, and tried to prepare myself for what was about to happen. I'd brought the photographs, the list of families, and contact information for Amy Chen and Margaret Chen. Detective Martinez was younger than I'd expected, maybe in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. She led me to a small conference room and offered me coffee, which I declined, because my hands were shaking too badly to hold a cup. Mrs. Whitman, she said, I understand you have some difficult information to share with me. I nodded, took a deep breath, and told her everything. About finding the photographs, about the pattern of families leaving the church, about my conversation with Margaret and Amy Chen, about the years of signs I'd ignored or explained away. Detective Martinez listened without interruption, taking notes, asking occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Whitman, she said finally, I need you to understand how brave you're being. I've worked on cases like this before, and I know how difficult it is for family members to come forward. The fact that you're willing to do this, to risk everything to protect other children, shows incredible courage. I don't feel brave, I said. I feel like a coward who waited too long. You're here now, she said. That's what matters. Detective Martinez explained the process to me. They would need to interview the victims, collect evidence, build a case that could stand up in court. It would take time, possibly months. There would be media attention, community backlash, pressure on everyone involved to drop the charges and move on. Are you prepared for that? She asked. I thought about Harold, sitting in his study that morning, reading his Bible and preparing for Sunday's sermon. I thought about the children in our congregation, the young families who trusted him with their most precious gifts. I thought about Amy Chen, living 3,000 miles away, but still carrying the scars of what he'd done to her. I'm prepared, I said. The arrest was scheduled for Friday afternoon, the day before our golden anniversary party. Detective Martinez wanted to take Harold into custody quietly, without a big scene that might traumatize the children, who would inevitably hear about it. I spent Thursday night sitting in my living room, looking at 50 years of photographs and memories, trying to figure out what was real and what had been performance. Harold was in his study, working on his sermon for Sunday, humming hymns under his breath the way he always did when he was content. He had no idea that his world was about to end. Friday morning, Harold kissed me goodbye before leaving for the church, the same perfunctory peck on the cheek he'd given me every morning for 50 years. He told me he'd be home by 5 for dinner, that he was looking forward to our anniversary celebration the next day. 50 years, Eleanor, he said, smiling that charming smile that had fooled so many people for so long. Can you believe it? 50 years of marriage, and I still feel like the luckiest man in the world. I watched him drive away, knowing it was the last time I'd see him as my husband. The next time I saw Harold Whitman, he'd be in handcuffs. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Detective Martinez called to let me know that Harold was in custody. The arrest had gone smoothly, she said. He hadn't resisted, hadn't tried to run, hadn't made a scene. He'd simply asked for a lawyer and refused to answer any questions. How did he react when you told him what the charges were? I asked. He didn't seem surprised, Detective Martinez said. If I had to guess, I'd say he's been expecting this for a long time. Maybe he had been. Maybe he'd been living with the knowledge that someday, somehow, his past would catch up with him. Maybe that's why he'd been so careful to maintain his image, to build up so much goodwill in the community, that people would find it hard to believe the accusations against him. Or maybe he'd simply been so confident in his ability to manipulate and control, that he'd never seriously considered the possibility of being caught. Susan called me at 4:30, her voice shaking with shock and disbelief. "Mom, I just heard the most ridiculous rumor. Someone told me that Dad was arrested this afternoon. Please tell me it's not true. Please tell me someone is spreading vicious lies about our family." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Susan, honey, I need you to come over. Right now. There are some things I need to tell you." She arrived within 20 minutes, her face pale and her hands trembling. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals, where she'd done her homework as a child, where we'd planned her wedding and celebrated the births of her daughters. "Mom, what's going on? Why won't you tell me over the phone? Why do you look like someone died?" I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. "Susan, your father has been arrested. The charges are very serious. And I'm the one who turned him in." The color drained from her face completely. "What are you talking about? What charges? Why would you?" "Mom, this doesn't make any sense." I told her everything. About the photographs, about the victims, about the years of abuse that had been hidden behind Harold's reputation as a man of God. I watched my daughter's face crumble as she realized that everything she'd believed about her father, about our family, about her own childhood, had been built on lies. "But he never did anything to me," she whispered. "He was a good father. He loved me. He taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. He wasn't a monster. He was just my dad." "I know, sweetheart. I know he was good to you. But that doesn't change what he did to other children. It doesn't make it less real, less horrible, less unforgivable." Susan started crying then, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. I got up and went around the table to hold her, to comfort her the way I had when she was small and frightened by thunderstorms or nightmares. But this nightmare was real, and there was no way to make it go away. "What about Emma and Sophie?" she asked suddenly, pulling back to look at me with wild, panicked eyes. "Oh my God, Mom, what about my daughters? Have they ever been alone with him? Has he ever touched them?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't think so. He's never shown any inappropriate interest in them that I've noticed. But Susan, you need to talk to them. You need to ask them, gently, if Grandpa has ever done anything that made them uncomfortable." Susan's face went white. I can't ask my babies about something like that. What if he did something to them? What if I failed to protect them the same way you failed to protect those other children?" Her words cut deep, but I didn't argue with them, because she was right. I had failed to protect those other children. I'd been so focused on maintaining my comfortable life, my respected position in the community, my identity as Harold's devoted wife, that I'd ignored the signs, dismissed the warnings, and enabled his crimes to continue. "Then we make sure it stops now," I said. "We make sure he can never hurt anyone else, ever again." The phone started ringing around 6 o'clock. Word was spreading through Cedar Falls that Harold Whitman, beloved pastor and pillar of the community, had been arrested on charges of child sexual abuse. The calls came from church members, neighbors, friends, and reporters. I let them all go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk to anyone else yet. I was still trying to process what I'd done, what it meant, what the consequences would be. Susan stayed with me that evening. She called her husband Mark and told him what had happened, asked him to keep Emma and Sophie at home and not to let them watch the news or answer the phone. She cancelled the anniversary party, making dozens of phone calls to guests, vendors, and the church to let them know that the celebration was off. She didn't tell anyone why. She just said there had been a family emergency and that the party would not be taking place. But I knew that by tomorrow, everyone would know the truth. That night, I lay in bed alone for the first time in 50 years. The house felt different, empty in a way that had nothing to do with Harold's physical absence. It felt like a tomb, a monument to decades of lies and willful ignorance. I thought about all the nights I'd slept beside a man who spent his days preying on children. I thought about all the times I'd kissed him goodbye, made his favorite meals, listened to his stories about his work at the church, proud of his dedication to helping young people. I thought about Amy Chen, Kelly Henderson, Sarah Martinez, and all the other children whose names I didn't know. I thought about the courage it must have taken for them to try to tell someone what was happening to them, and the crushing disappointment they must have felt when they weren't believed. I thought about their parents, who'd trusted Harold with their most precious gifts. I thought about the other wives in our congregation, who'd looked at Harold and me as an example of what marriage could be. And I thought about Susan, who'd grown up believing that her father was a hero, that her parents' marriage was something to aspire to, that faith and love and commitment could overcome any obstacle. I'd given her 50 years of lies. And now I had to live with the knowledge that in trying to protect her from the truth, I'd robbed her of the ability to protect her own children. The next morning, Saturday, our golden anniversary, I woke up alone. I made coffee for one, read the newspaper alone, and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. The story was on the front page of the Cedar Falls Gazette. Local pastor arrested on child abuse charges. The article was respectful but thorough, outlining the allegations against Harold and mentioning that his wife had cooperated with the investigation. My phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting statements, church members wanting explanations, friends and neighbors wanting to know if it was true. I unplugged the phone and drew the curtains. Susan came over around noon with Emma and Sophie. The girls were confused about why their anniversary party had been cancelled, why their mother looked like she'd been crying, why their grandfather wasn't there to give them the special gifts he'd promised. "Where's Grandpa?" Emma asked. "He said he had something special to show us today." I looked at Susan, who was struggling to hold herself together. We'd talked about what to tell the children, how much they needed to know, how to explain something that was impossible to explain. "Grandpa is sick," Susan said finally. "He has to go away for a while to get better." "What kind of sick?" Sophie asked. "The kind that makes people do bad things," Susan said. "The kind that means he can't be around children anymore." Emma frowned. "Did he do bad things to us?" "No, sweetheart. He never did bad things to you. But he did bad things to other children, and that's why he has to go away." I watched my granddaughters process this information, their young minds trying to understand how someone they loved and trusted could be dangerous. I saw the confusion in their eyes, the fear, the beginning of the knowledge that the world was not as safe as they'd believed. And I realized that this was Harold's final crime. Not just what he'd done to his direct victims, but what he'd done to every child who'd trusted him, every family who'd believed in him, every person who'd looked up to him as a moral leader. He'd poisoned the well of trust. He'd made it impossible for any of us to feel completely safe again. Detective Martinez called me that afternoon to update me on the investigation. 3 more victims had come forward since Harold's arrest, she said. 2 were women in their 30s who'd been abused as children, and 1 was a teenager, whose parents had noticed changes in her behavior after she'd started attending youth group. "We're expecting more," Detective Martinez said. "Word is spreading that people are finally safe to come forward. We've set up a hotline for victims and witnesses." "How is Harold doing?" I asked. "He's being held without bail. The judge considered him a flight risk and a danger to the community. His lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but given the number of victims and the severity of the charges, it's unlikely we'll accept anything less than significant prison time." "How long?" I asked. "If he's convicted on all charges, he's looking at life in prison. He's 72 years old, Mrs. Whitman. He'll never be a free man again." I should have felt relief, satisfaction, justice, but all I felt was emptiness. 50 years of marriage, ended. A community's faith, shattered. Dozens of lives, damaged beyond repair. And at the center of it all, me. The woman who'd lived with a monster and called it love. Sunday morning, I got dressed and drove to First Methodist Church for the first time since Harold's arrest. I wasn't sure what kind of reception I'd receive, but I knew I needed to face the congregation, to look them in the eye and acknowledge what I'd done. The parking lot was fuller than usual, which surprised me. I'd expected people to stay away, to avoid the scene of Harold's crimes. But as I walked toward the church, I realized why so many people had come. They needed to be together. They needed to share their shock, their grief, their anger. They needed to try to make sense of what had happened to their community, their faith, their understanding of good and evil. I walked into the sanctuary and felt every eye turn toward me. Some looks were sympathetic, some were curious, some were hostile. I took my usual seat in the third pew, the same seat I'd occupied for 50 years, right beside the empty space where Harold used to sit. Pastor Williams, the associate pastor who'd been with our church for 5 years, stood at the pulpit. His face was drawn, his voice shaky as he began to speak. "My friends," he said, "we are gathered here today in the shadow of terrible revelations. We are struggling to understand how someone we trusted, someone we loved, someone we looked up to as a spiritual leader, could have betrayed that trust so completely." He paused, looked directly at me, then continued. "We are also here to acknowledge the courage of those who came forward to speak the truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. We are here to support the victims of these crimes, and we are here to begin the long process of healing." I felt tears running down my cheeks, but I didn't wipe them away. I deserved to feel exposed, vulnerable, broken. I deserved to sit in this sanctuary and face the consequences of my 50 years of silence. After the service, people approached me with a mixture of emotions I'd never experienced before. Some offered comfort, telling me they couldn't imagine how difficult it must have been to turn in my own husband. Others were less kind, whispering questions about what I'd known and when I'd known it. But it was Margaret Chen who stayed with me the longest. She sat beside me in that empty pew after most of the congregation had left, her hand resting gently on my arm. "Eleanor," she said, "Amy called me this morning. She wanted me to tell you something." I looked at her, afraid of what was coming next. "She said that what you did, coming forward, speaking up, making sure Harold can't hurt anyone else, it's given her something she's never had before. Peace. For the first time in 30 years, she feels like someone finally believed her. Someone finally chose to protect children over protecting a reputation." I started crying again, but these tears felt different. Cleaner, somehow. "She also wanted you to know that she's coming back to Cedar Falls next month. She wants to testify at Harold's trial. She wants to look him in the eye and tell him that she's not that scared little girl anymore, that he doesn't have power over her anymore." Over the following weeks, more victims came forward. The hotline Detective Martinez had mentioned received dozens of calls. Some were from Harold's direct victims, children he'd abused during his years as youth pastor. Others were from parents who'd had suspicions, but had been too afraid to speak up, friends who'd witnessed inappropriate behavior, but had convinced themselves they were imagining things. The pattern was always the same. Harold would identify vulnerable children, shy kids, kids from troubled homes, kids who craved adult attention and approval. He'd spend months grooming them, building trust, making them feel special and chosen. He'd create opportunities to be alone with them, always with plausible explanations. And then he'd exploit their trust in ways that would scar them for life. Susan struggled more than anyone. The daughter who'd spent 50 years adoring her father, who'd planned an elaborate celebration of his marriage, who'd held him up as an example of faith and integrity, now had to reconcile that image with the reality of what he'd done. She went to therapy, brought Emma and Sophie to child psychologists to make sure they hadn't been harmed, and slowly began the process of rebuilding her understanding of her own childhood. She asked me hard questions about what I'd known, when I'd suspected, why I'd waited so long to act. I answered them all honestly, even when the truth made me look like a coward, even when it revealed the depth of my complicity. I owed her honesty. I owed everyone honesty. "Mom," she said one afternoon as we sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd planned Harold's meals and listened to his stories about his work with children, "I keep thinking about all the times I left Emma and Sophie alone with him. All the times I thought I was giving them a special relationship with their grandfather. What if I was putting them in danger?" "You had no way of knowing," I said. "He was very good at hiding what he was. But you knew, didn't you? Deep down, you knew something was wrong." I considered lying, softening the truth to make her feel better. But I'd spent 50 years lying, and I was done with that. "Yes," I said, "I think I did know. I think I chose not to see it, because seeing it would have meant destroying everything I'd built my life around. Susan was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm angry at you, Mom. I'm angry that you didn't protect those children. I'm angry that you let it go on for so long. I'm angry that you put your comfort above their safety. I'm angry at me too," I said. "But I'm also grateful," she continued, "because you finally did the right thing. You finally chose courage over comfort. And that took strength I'm not sure I would have had." The trial began 6 months later. Harold had initially tried to maintain his innocence, but as more victims came forward and the evidence mounted, his lawyer advised him to accept a plea deal. He would plead guilty to multiple counts of child sexual abuse in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. I attended every day of the sentencing hearings. I sat in the back of the courtroom and listened as victim after victim stood up to confront the man who'd stolen their innocence, their trust, their sense of safety in the world. Amy Chen flew in from Seattle. She was 38 years old now, a successful lawyer with 2 daughters of her own. But when she stood at that podium to address Harold, I could see traces of the scared little girl she'd been. "Harold Whitman," she said, her voice strong and clear, "you stole my childhood. You taught me that the adults I trusted could hurt me, that my body wasn't my own, that shame was something I deserved to carry. You made me believe that what happened was my fault, that I was dirty and broken and unlovable." Harold sat at the defendant's table, his head bowed, his hands folded. He looked like a broken old man, nothing like the charismatic pastor, who'd commanded respect and admiration for decades. "But I want you to know something," Amy continued. "I survived. I got help. I learned to trust again, to love again, to see myself as worthy of happiness. I have a beautiful family, a career I love, a life full of joy and purpose. And none of that is because of you. All of that is in spite of you." She paused, looked directly at Harold, and said, "You have no power over me anymore. You never will again." When it was time for Harold to speak, his lawyer stood and said that his client chose to remain silent. Harold never apologized, never acknowledged what he'd done, never showed any remorse for the lives he'd destroyed. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. He would die behind bars, and he would never have the opportunity to hurt another child. After the sentencing, I approached Amy in the courthouse hallway. I didn't know what to say, how to apologize for 50 years of enabling the man who'd hurt her. "Mrs. Whitman," she said before I could speak, "I want to thank you." "Thank me?" I was confused. "Amy, I failed you. I should have listened when your mother tried to tell me what was happening. I should have protected you. You were a victim too," she said gently. "Maybe not in the same way we were, but Harold manipulated you, lied to you, used you to maintain his cover. And when you finally understood what was happening, you did the right thing. You chose us over him. You chose truth over comfort." "It took me too long," I said. "But you did it," she replied. "And that matters. That means something." I moved out of the house Harold and I had shared for 30 years. I couldn't live there anymore, surrounded by memories of a life that had been built on lies. I found a small apartment across town, close to Susan and the girls, and tried to figure out who I was without Harold, without the identity I'd worn for 50 years as his devoted wife. The church struggled to survive the scandal. Many families left, unable to worship in a place that had been the scene of so much pain. Others stayed, determined to rebuild their community and their faith on a foundation of truth rather than comfortable illusions. Pastor Williams asked me to speak to the congregation one Sunday, to share what I'd learned about the importance of listening to children, believing victims, and choosing courage over comfort. I was terrified, but I agreed. Standing at the pulpit where Harold had delivered hundreds of sermons, I looked out at the faces of people I'd known for decades. Some were sympathetic, some were curious, some were still angry. All of them deserved honesty. "My friends," I began, "I stand before you today as a woman who lived 50 years of her life believing in a lie. I was married to a man I thought I knew, a man I trusted, a man I defended against accusations that turned out to be true." I paused, gathered my courage, and continued. "I failed children in this community. I failed their parents. I failed you. When mothers came to me with concerns about their daughters, I chose loyalty to my husband over the safety of their children. When children showed signs of trauma, I explained it away rather than asking the hard questions. When families left our church suddenly, I accepted Harold's explanations rather than wondering what had really driven them away. The sanctuary was completely silent. I can't undo the past. I can't give those children back their innocence, their trust, their sense of safety. I can't restore the faith that Harold's actions have shaken. But I can tell you this: if a child ever tells you that an adult has hurt them, believe them. If your instincts tell you something isn't right, listen to them. If you have to choose between protecting an institution and protecting a child, choose the child. Every time. Without hesitation, I looked directly at the parents in the congregation, many of whom had young children. Your children are precious gifts. They deserve to be safe, to be protected, to be believed. Don't let anyone, not a pastor, not a teacher, not a family member, not anyone, convince you that your concerns about their welfare are unfounded. Trust your instincts. Ask hard questions. And if you discover that someone has hurt your child, speak up. No matter who it is, no matter how respected they are, no matter what it might cost you. When I finished speaking, the congregation was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, people began to applaud. It wasn't the enthusiastic applause Harold used to receive after his sermons. It was something different: acknowledgement, perhaps, or forgiveness, or simply recognition that speaking difficult truths requires a different kind of courage than delivering comfortable lies. A year later, I received a letter from Kelly Henderson, the little girl whose mother had tried to warn me about Harold back in 1987. Kelly was 45 now, living in Oregon with her husband and teenage son. Dear Mrs. Whitman, the letter began, I heard about what happened with your husband, and I wanted you to know that I'm grateful you finally found the courage to speak up. I know it couldn't have been easy to turn in someone you'd been married to for so long. She went on to tell me about her life, about the years of therapy she'd needed to process what Harold had done to her, about the relationships she'd struggled with, about the way his abuse had affected every aspect of her development. For a long time, I was angry at you, she wrote. I was angry that you didn't believe my mother when she tried to tell you what was happening. I was angry that you defended him, that you made us feel like we were lying or imagining things. But I'm not angry anymore. I understand now how hard it must have been to see the truth about someone you loved, someone you'd built your life around. I understand how easy it would have been to keep looking the other way, to keep protecting your comfortable life rather than facing reality. What you did took courage. It took the kind of courage I'm not sure I would have had in your position. And because of what you did, Harold can never hurt another child. That matters. That means something. She ended the letter with words that I've read dozens of times since. Thank you for finally choosing us over him. Thank you for finally putting children's safety above your own comfort. Thank you for showing that it's never too late to do the right thing. I keep that letter in my purse now, and I read it whenever I start to feel overwhelmed by guilt, whenever I start to think that speaking up was too little, too late. Because Kelly's right, it's never too late to do the right thing. Harold died in prison 3 years after his sentencing. He was 75 years old, and he died alone, without visitors, without mourners, without anyone to grieve his passing. I felt nothing when I got the call. No sadness, no relief, no sense of closure. Just emptiness. I didn't attend his funeral. There was no funeral, actually. No one claimed his body. No one arranged for services. No one wanted to be associated with his memory. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, and I think that's appropriate. Men who prey on children don't deserve to be remembered. Today, I'm 76 years old. I've been living alone for 4 years now, and I've learned things about myself I never knew during my 50 years of marriage. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was. I've learned that I can survive the destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. I've learned that truth, no matter how painful, is always better than comfortable lies. I volunteer now at a crisis center for children, answering phones on the hotline, talking to kids who need someone to believe them, someone to tell them that what happened to them wasn't their fault. It's the least I can do, and it's the most important work I've ever done. Sometimes the children I talk to remind me of Amy Chen, of Kelly Henderson, of all the other children Harold hurt. Sometimes I think about how different their lives might have been if I'd found the courage to speak up sooner. But then I remember what Amy told me in that courthouse hallway. It's not about how long it took me to find courage. It's about the fact that I finally found it at all. The truth is heavy. The truth is painful. The truth can destroy everything you thought you knew about your life, your marriage, your faith, your community. But the truth is also healing. The truth can set you free. The truth can protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. I was married to Harold Whitman for 50 years. I thought I knew him. I thought I loved him. I thought I was living a good life, a faithful life, a life that honored God and served others. I was wrong about everything except the part about serving others. Because in the end, that's what telling the truth was: service. Service to the children Harold had hurt. Service to the children he might have hurt in the future. Service to a community that deserved better than comfortable lies. It took me 50 years to learn that lesson, but I learned it. And I pray that others won't wait as long as I did to choose courage over comfort, truth over lies, children's safety over their own reputation. Because in the end, that's all that matters. Not the golden anniversary parties, not the community respect, not the comfortable illusions we build around ourselves. What matters is whether we choose to protect the innocent, whether we choose to speak up for those who have no voice, whether we choose to do the right thing even when it costs us everything. I made the right choice, eventually. I just wish I'd made it sooner.